Well, good morning. It's good to see everybody. I actually ran into a former student a few minutes ago, so that was a special treat. I'm sure he'll be grading me harshly. We have been warned to stay on schedule, and so my plan this morning is I just wanted to spend about 5 minutes giving you a little bit of context about what economic growth has been like in the region and in the country for the last 15, 20 years. Spend about 5 minutes giving you my forecast for this year, and then spend about 5 minutes talking about a few things I'm keeping my eyes on as we move into the year, of things that might cause me to bump that forecast up or down. Okay, so again, if we want to go ahead and this is rough. I can't really see the slides from where you are, so I guess they can start running a movie if it gets too bad. But I've often thought that if you got 100 economists in a room and locked them in there and said, "I'm not letting you out until you can agree on one thing," that what they would do is die in that room. But I think that if 20 years ago, what they would have certainly agreed on would have been that normal economic growth in the United States is about 3.5%. Okay, that won't get you on Mount Rushmore if you're the president, but that's normal economic growth. So now, if we want to go to the next slide, there's actually two things here. And I have to peek to make sure I get the colors right here. But yeah, the blue graph there, that's actual real U.S. GDP. Okay, so quick refresher: GDP, that's the value of all the goods and services that we generate in the country. Real GDP means that it's just corrected for inflation. Okay, so the blue graph there, that's real U.S. GDP. Now the red one that I've superimposed on there, that's a nice smooth plot for what it would look like if GDP grew at a constant 3.5%, like a bank account, just going up exactly 3% every year. Now, I think looking at that, there's probably two things that strike you. On the left side of the picture, what strikes you, I think, is just how closely it tracks that curve, right? That there's obviously bumps and wiggles, but it's darn near perfect, a 3.5% growth rate. And I'm sure what also strikes you, looking at the right side of that picture, is the fact that something's happened in the last 10, 15 years, and that 3.5% growth maybe isn't what we should expect anymore. In the next slide, I'm going to zoom on in. Yeah, so in the next slide, I'm zooming in there since the year 2000, just so you can get a closer look. And of course, what you can see is that since the year 2000, we haven't been anywhere near 3.5%. And in fact, what we've averaged annual rate would be 1.8%. Okay, so this appears to be a real change. Now, on the next slide, yeah, this is again the same picture zooming in, showing that the slowdown started quickly after 2000, but it really accelerated in the second part of that decade. But what I want to impress upon you now, I'm going to talk about what might be going on here in the last few minutes of the presentation. But what I want to press upon you now is that this is not just the recession. Okay, this is not just a case of, well, we're coming out of a recession. And to illustrate that, if we now go to the next slide, this is what a normal recession looks like. So we've had 11 recessions since World War II. What I've zoomed in on here is the 1980s, so this would be the 1982 recession. So those of you that are my age or older, you remember this. This was a nasty recession, okay? But this is the typical pattern. The economy slows, it shrinks, it starts to grow again, and then it shoots up and gets us back on that 3.5% growth track within a few years. And so, of course, this is what everybody expected to be happening back in 2003. In 2004, in 2005, and I often like to say this reminds me of that girl who broke up with me my freshman year of college, that eventually my friends had to come in and say, "Tim, she's not coming back." That we're starting to wonder if maybe 3.5% isn't coming back. And so again, I'll talk some at the end about this to give some of the theories of what's going on. But again, to place my forecast into context, 1.8% growth has been now the average this century. Okay? The next slide is going to make this a little bit closer to home. It's going to look at Illinois. So you can see what it's looked like. And so since 2000, Illinois annual economic growth has been less than 1%, 0.8%. The next slide takes it in even closer to home. This is the St. Louis MSA, the St. Louis metropolitan area. You can see it's even slightly slower, 0.7%. Okay? Then the last slide, or the next slide here is Madison County. Okay? Now, the government doesn't produce GDP statistics for counties, so what I have here is real personal income, which is generally considered a fairly good proxy for GDP. And again, you can see 0.8% growth. Now, I don't put these up here to depress all of us. If you go to the next slide, I put it up here to provide us sort of the context for my forecast, or what one might call the no-brainer forecast. If we were just going to assume that 2017 is going to look like the last 15 years, these would be sort of the averages. Again, 1.8 for the US, 0.8 for Illinois, 0.7 for St. Louis MSA, and then 0.8 for Madison County. So keep these numbers in mind. I'll bring them back when I give you my forecast, because they then are the context or the comparison to mine. Okay? So on the next slide, what you need to know about my forecast. So there's a small group of us that sort of maintain a small forecasting model at the university. And it's a collaboration in the sense that it's a collaboration when it works, and when it doesn't work, it's all mine. But anyhow, we maintain this in sort of a small way. And there's two things you need to know. Well, the first is that it's purely a quantitative model, and by that I mean that it looks at trends, it looks at patterns, it looks at correlations. I always say it reads the economics section of the paper, it doesn't read the political section of the paper. So it's not keeping track of who's in the White House or what tax bill is making its way through Springfield. It's purely looking at the numbers, okay? And the other thing you need to know, of course, is that it's always changing, right? So it changes for two reasons. The first is, of course, I can't resist tinkering with it. But the second one is that new numbers are always rolling in, new retail sales figures, new employment figures. And so what that means is if you see me give this presentation somewhere else in 3 months, the numbers might be slightly different, okay? So the next slide has my 2017 forecasts, and I'll call them mine until they turn out to be right, and then I guess I can give my colleagues credit. But this is what my model is predicting. So 2.3% for the US, 1.3% for Illinois, 1% for St. Louis MSA, and 1.5 for Madison County. Now, again, I've got what I'm calling my no-brainer forecast sitting next to it so that you can put it into the context of the last 15 years. And that's because, if we go to the next slide, if I would have given this 20 years ago, these numbers, everybody afterwards would have been saying, oh, so you're pretty pessimistic about things. You think things are going to slow down. In the context of the last 15 years, these are somewhat optimistic numbers. If we would have had these growth rates for the last, well, we haven't had these growth rates for the last 15 years. So these are somewhat optimistic. Okay? Now, the next slide is, I just put it into a little bit of comparison with some other large forecasts. So I have up here the Conference Board, the IMF, the Wall Street Journal. We're either all going to be right or we're all going to be wrong, because as you can see, we're all within 1/10 of a percentage point of each other. In some ways, I feel like I'm not giving you your money's worth for just repeating what everybody else seems to be predicting. But you can see that the Conference Board, 2.3%, IMF, 2.3%, and this is for the U.S. The Wall Street Journal, theirs is 2.4%. So my forecasts are pretty much in line with everybody else's. Again, I think the context being that they're pessimistic by post-World War II standards. They're slightly optimistic by 2000 and beyond standards. Now, the last few minutes, what I want to talk to you about is a few things that I'm keeping my eyes on. Okay? Obviously, like any other forecast, they're probably not going to turn out to be right. I'd love nothing more than to come back here a year from now and say I was right, but that probably won't happen. But what am I keeping my eyes on during the next couple of months that might cause me to to consider bumping it up or down a little bit. And I have two things here, regulatory uncertainty and labor force participation. So if we go on to the next slide. Yeah. So obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty out there right now, okay? There's uncertainty at the national level about the new administration, about international trade policy, about banking and financial regulation, about the dollar. Okay? There are all kinds of things that we're just not sure about. Okay? At the more local level, obviously, in the state of Illinois, we have the budget situation, right? Now, in almost any other state, if I put that up, it means what will be in the budget. In Illinois, it's will there be a budget, right? And so I guess what I'd like to impress upon you is the sort of cost of uncertainty, okay? That we could talk about this banking regulation or that banking regulation or this particular thing making its way into the budget or not making its way into the budget. And sure, those things could potentially affect the forecast, but there's a drag just due to the uncertainty. And so I guess what I would say is if we get to be here at, say, Mother's Day or the beginning of summer, and we still don't really know what's going to happen to Sarbanes-Oxley, we really still don't know whether NAFTA is going to be broken open again and renegotiated, we still don't have a budget in Springfield, then I would probably want to slice a tenth or two of a percentage point off of my forecast. If you tell me that by the beginning of summer that we'll have a budget in Springfield and that some of the national things will have been resolved, one way or the other, regardless of how they get resolved, I would probably want to bump an extra tenth or two of a percentage point onto my forecasts, okay? Again, it's just the drag of the uncertainty, okay? Then the other thing I'm going to be keeping my eye on sort of goes back to, next slide, please. Yeah. The what's going on, the what the heck is going on portion of this curve. And again, this is what economists wouldn't agree on. I could probably give you at least 30 different theories for what's going on. But I think in many ways the best way to understand it is to go back and remind ourselves where economic growth comes from, and that's on the next slide. Basically, it's as I teach in my class, it's how many people do we have cranking stuff out and how much are they cranking out per person? That's really where economic growth comes from. You either need more people doing stuff or you need the existing people being more efficient and more productive. And so many economists are looking at the second one, the how productive we are, and they are talking about things like business investment and patents and things of that nature. But this morning I want to close by talking about the first one, which is labor force participation. So if we go on now to the next slide, this is U.S. labor force participation going back to first quarter of 2000, and this is for working age adults, okay, so 25 to 54, prime working age. And what you can see is that it's separated out for men and women. Okay, so the blue curve up top is men, and the red curve on the lower one is women. And what you can see is both, for men and women, for each of those two groups, it's fallen about 3 percentage points during this time period. Okay? Now, often when I teach labor economics, I say, well, labor economics things are nice to say, they move so darn slowly, right? And they usually do, like most demographic things. They move fairly slowly. So to have something dropping 3 percentage points in 15 years is a fairly big change. It doesn't look like it on that graph, and that's why on the next graph I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So for the same numbers, just zooming in a little bit so you can see a little bit better where it started and where it's ended. And again, this is about a 3 percentage point decline for both men and women during this time period. Okay? Remember, one of the things that can drive the economy is how many people are working, how many people are cranking stuff out. Okay? Now, if you just do sort of a simple back of the envelope calculation and you say, what if this hadn't happened? What if the population, the working age population had stayed the same? The number of people available to work had stayed the same, but the percentage of them in the labor force had stayed where it was in the year 2000. That translates into about 4 million workers. Okay, so about 4 million workers at the national level that would be in the labor force if the participation rate had stayed where it was. The participation rate's really just the fraction or percentage that are either working or looking for work. Okay? Now, the next slide. The county level data is less precise. As you might imagine, there's not as much surveying done, and there's smaller samples and whatnot. And it also requires me to piece together a couple of different data sources, and that's always another issue. But I tried to present here a sort of back of the envelope calculation that would be similar to the previous one, but would be for Madison County. Okay? And so, again, you can see that the labor force participation rate, now notice this graph just goes back to 2005, just because of the survey I used. It's the American Community Survey. It really started in 2005, okay? So you can see that it's fallen 3.5 percentage points just since 2005. And again, this is the participation rate. So this isn't just that people are unemployed, because as long as you're actively seeking work, as long as you just tell the government survey folks that, yeah, I'm sending out resumes. This isn't the unemployment system where you have to prove it in some way. This is just, you just have to tell a pollster, yeah, I'm looking for work. That number has fallen 3.5 percentage points in the last 10 years. Next slide. Again, that 3.5 percentage points, if you just do a quick little back of the envelope calculation and say, suppose Madison County's population did what it did during that time period, but let's suppose that the participation rate did not fall that 3.5%. Let's suppose it just stuck where it was. That translates back of the envelope again to about 7,600. I fish around for the best term to use here. I settled because I had to settle on something on the phrase missing. But 7,600 missing workers. Again, those are folks that would either be working or looking for work if this graph had just stayed flat instead of falling. Okay? So again, just next slide, just talking again about what I mean by missing. Again, these folks haven't left the county. We're not saying that they've packed up and moved somewhere else. They're still part of the resident population, okay? And they're not unemployed, not in the traditional sense that they're laid off and they're looking for work. These are people who, again, are answering the question. When the question is, are you looking for work? The answer is no. Okay? So they're neither working nor looking for work. Okay? Now, I could point you to 10 or 12, again, different theories about what this represents in cultural changes and economic changes. Okay? But I think the implications are probably what I want to close with. So on the next slide here. Yeah. It has two implications. The first, just going back to where I started this with my graphs of GDP, that if we want the economy to grow, we need people cranking out stuff. And so these missing workers are people who are not cranking out stuff, okay? And so these missing workers, getting them back into the labor force, getting them back to work is important for economic growth. But then I think for the businesses in the room, I think what it means is that that hiring methods may need to reflect this, that if folks are not sending out resumes and doing the things that they would have done in the past, then maybe traditional hiring methods, the running the ad, putting a job posting at the web page, that those things we might see those things being less effective, and things that are more proactive, and things that are working with community organizations or churches or local government or placement agencies, that those things might be where more and more businesses have to look if we want to bring these missing workers back into the workforce.